My name is Dylan Kirk. During the day, I'm actually a diplomat for Her Majesty's Canadian government. Currently working in Paris, but I've been through Hong Kong, Sri Lanka, China, and the Philippines, as well as sundry other places in East Asia. When I was starting gaming, it was mainly just playing chess with my dad, maybe when I was 6 or 7 years old. And I remember the very first game because I cried a lot, and he just sat there not letting me do anything to, take back moves or anything like that. So it's he never allowed me to win a game, ever. And that was the greatest thing he could have done for me because I just tried harder. I kept on wanting to play more and more and more. I wanted to beat him. So when I finally did, it meant something. And he was probably, now as a dad, I realize he was probably a lot prouder than I was of myself at that time. So really, starting gaming, it was me and my dad. And when I discovered he had these tiny little 1/75 scale painted German tanks that he had hidden away from me for so long, probably because I would have broken them, and that he was a miniatures gamer, that's when it all started coming out. So I think around 11, I got into miniatures gaming with my dad, and that was it. I was a gamer. At that point, I knew I identified as a gamer. So I was designing games from the point that I realized you could design games. Like when I saw that my dad had a bunch of these handwritten notes on pieces of paper about ranges and all of the armor thicknesses of all of the tanks that he owned, I not only started to want to perfect his system, I wanted to, bring more realism and, make sure that I was calculating the number of millimeters of armor between the Panzer IV-D and 4F variants or whatever, and all that kind of wonderful stuff. But I also started branching into other forms of wargaming and adapting the RPGs that we were playing. I started designing other various board games throughout the time that I was in university, like war game stuff. I'm principally a wargamer. I come principally from wargamer stock. But after that, I really wanted my wife to kind of appreciate the games that I was designing and wanted her to play. So I started branching out into more different themes and different interests. And that's kind of when I broke into the idea for doing something on Japanese history as the first game that I published. So the game that became Genji was an idea that I had on a plane between Tokyo and Colombo because I wanted to make a game for a particular design competition. And the design competition had a theme that was something like There and Back Again. So I started basic idea of a rail system in a circle where you're traveling around and doing various things. The thing is, I wanted to base it on Japanese history because that's the history that I'm most familiar with. And I remembered that in the first railway that was built in Japan, everyone who went to the railway for the very first kind of inaugural voyage of this train, when they stepped onto the train, they left their shoes on the side of the track because they stepped up into a train, and Japanese people are used to removing their shoes when they step up onto another step. So they watched in horror as the doors closed and they slowly pulled away from their shoes. So I thought this would be a hilarious thing if we had just a game where you were running around trying to get your shoes off the first train rail in Japan. While I was flying, that slowly started evolving to the point where it was romantics, kind of a romantic story of men running around in the night in Kyoto attempting to write poetry to woo the young ladies that they were interested in. How that convoluted change occurred is something that I'm not quite certain, but eventually it kind of developed into a story about romance, in effect. So that was the first game that I published back in 2008. I haven't published anything since. I've been working a lot on other stuff, in part just to entertain my children. So my son is also a minis, like you can just see, he's a miniatures gamer. He absolutely loves doing doing minis gaming. So what I have wanted to do is just kind of develop stuff to match his kind of ability to understand the rules and keep playing. Right now, he's already on hex and counter games. He's 10 years old. He's been playing stuff like The Tide at Sunrise. That's what we've been playing recently. So it's something he's now able to grasp, and we together like to modify games and try to design new games. And I try to keep his attention because it's very difficult sometimes. It's got to be a lot of flash. You can't hold your game design close to your chest. If you can't talk about your game design or kind of show off your game design, it's very, very difficult to improve it. Like, there's no such thing as something that's your baby and that you've got to keep in that design forever and ever, amen. A game design, just like any battle plan, is the first casualty of contact with the enemy. You have to playtest it, you have to talk about it, you have to be able to explain it to people very, very fast. If you can't do that, it's very, very difficult to focus on what's important in your game design, and that's going to be the core experience. So once you've got your game design, excellent. Maybe you've written some rules, maybe you've drawn some stuff on cards. Whatever, great. Ask yourself, what do you want a player to get out of the game? What's the experience you want them to have? What interaction do you want them to have? Things like that. When I was writing the rules for Genji, I wanted to write them in such a way that one of two things would happen. Either the people around the table would make bawdy jokes about getting with each other's girlfriends, or they would actually take a look at the poetry and have a lovely time with their significant other or others or whatever. So I actually wanted a metagame to exist in the game. That's what I had written the rules toward. If that's what you're searching for, make sure that it exists in your game and make sure that no mechanic in the game takes away from that. If that's the central intent, keep around the central intent. Always rally to the colors. Once you've got that central intent, shave away all of the mechanics that you think are, even if you think they're cool, shave them away if they don't reflect that central intent. And keep testing. Just keep testing over and over and over again. Be open to critique, and then realize at a certain point, not all critique is useful. Just to give an example, I was at a GDC down in San Francisco a year or two ago, and there was a panel on player experience. For computer games, player experience is completely different than for board games. Art is actually important in player experience. That kind of immersion comes from the visual and audio interaction with players. And one of the things that one of the panel members mentioned was, we've tested our game on players where we have all these different weapons and they all do the same amount of damage, but the ones that look like they do more damage, people say that they're overpowered. And it's simply because of the way they're experiencing the game. If someone says, my experience of the game is X, and factually on paper, you know that you can crunch the numbers and say, the truth is not X, you just felt that way. Well, that feeling's important. The fact that they felt that way is part of their experience, and you can't simply discount that. Does it mean you need to change the rules? Not necessarily. Does it mean you need to make a different representation of that particular mechanic? Perhaps. Maybe you need to ask people whether they feel that this is an overpowered mechanic and change the way that it's described or change the way that it's represented on the board. Granularity can be a difficult thing to deal with. The more granularity you have, for example, instead of having 10 hit points, you have 100 hit points, and you can do 50 damage. Well, why not have 2 hit points? And 50 damage is the same as 1 damage on a 2 hit point system. So you can always cut down and make, if you want to make something seem amazing, sure, have 100 hit points and make something do 50 damage. Games are the sole way, I believe, in which humans have learned over time. Games are hardwired into the human experience, and children are born playing what they see. I believe that the native mode of education is playing games. What's more, if you see kind of the difference between video game culture and board game culture, and I kind of straddle both, it's face-to-face in board games, and the people who are involved in the board game are also the source of the rules, or the kind of defense of the rules of the board game. They're responsible for every member of that board game having a fair experience. So it's just like Huizinga said in Homo Ludens, you're creating a sacred space in which all people are participating, in effect, in a constructed fiction. You're creating a universe on a piece of cardboard, and everyone agrees to follow the rules of that universe for a short amount of time within that sacred space. And being able to agree to that sacred space with other people around you and to make certain that the rules of that sacred space are maintained not only develops trust in other people within that group, but it shows ways of working together in ordinary society that maybe a lot of the lack of face-to-face that we've had with people has made us lose. Games are important, so not just for that social aspect, also learning aspect. My children have learned so much from playing games. But games can take all sorts of different forms. They can take, just playing pretend. Just my kids sitting down and playing teacher is a game where they're learning about their environment. They're experimenting with things. It's a place where you can play diplomacy, stab someone in the back, see how that feels, see how winning through subterfuge feels on a board, and get up and shake hands. And you've played with that idea. You've been able to experience something in the sacred space that maybe you wouldn't necessarily, as a human being, want to do in real life. And that to me is important. Being able to try new things, experience new things. Like I said, it's the native mode for humans to educate themselves. And I think that kind of spirit of fair play in board games, it doesn't have to be there in computer games because the computer takes care of all of the variables. The computer takes care of the rules. And if the rules don't benefit you, then I'm sorry, too bad, so sad. Whereas we're the guardians of fairness as board game players. We're the people who make sure everyone has a good experience. With regards to kind of the Gamergate issue, the kind of toxic masculinity issue, mainly in video gaming, but we could say in gaming writ large. As I've said, kind of fairness is something that we all construct as players of games, especially board games where we're all participating within the rules to create a fair experience for everyone. And I believe that fair experience has to be expanded to life in general in all things, that everyone should be welcome at the table. We should refer to that person in the way in which they would like to be referred to. I think that we, as board gamers, can kind of increase the general feeling of fairness in society by being accepting and by allowing people to participate in our sacred spaces, playing with them, and making them feel welcome. It's one of the greatest things in the board gaming community that we can create an open seat at the table for everyone. And as a game designer, being able to design an experience that allows people to experience that, I think that's kind of the most important thing that a game designer can do. You're building something that lets a new person sit at the table and participate with other people in an open and caring and friendly environment. I think that there's a lot of people, a lot of board game commentators who have opened our eyes to the ways, for example, in which discrimination has entered into gaming or has always been a part of gaming. And we need to say absolutely no. Just if someone makes a discriminatory comment, there are nice ways of saying, this is an open table. Everyone's welcome here, and that can be a hurtful comment. And maybe that person's never been told that before. We can set the bar higher, and that's our prerogative. As gamers, this is what we do. We accept people to our table, and we enjoy our experience together. Because China, just from my experience in China is a completely booming market, and it's utterly different from ours. It's utterly and completely different from ours. They're extremely cafe-driven. It's mainly females in the cafes rather than males. It is very, very social. It's something you see Chinese people on the corner just playing cards with each other on their block. It's normal. It's very, very normal there to just hang out and play games. So I'm interested in not just who's doing Kickstarters here, but who's making the big hits in China that are being sold in corner stores for, say, under 100 yuan, which is anywhere from $15 to $20, depending on exchange. All of the kind of mass-produced stuff out there. So, and also, mainland China is making huge copies of anything that gets big in the West, especially when it's close to Hong Kong and they can sell to Hong Kong. So yeah, not just North America is something that I'm interested in. You look out at East Asia. Jolly Thinkers is one of the publishers out there that I like to know what they're doing and like to know what their market's interested in. Here, 5 players tops kind of thing. Generally, you're looking at anywhere between 45 minutes and an hour kind of playtime. Out there, it's got to be fast. It's got to play at least 8 people around a table, and it's got to be, really, really engaged and cutthroat. That's the Hong Kong market, like completely different market. So, yeah, like when people talk about trends, they tend to talk about North American trends and maybe European trends. With the expansion of the middle class out east, selling to the Chinese market's actually viable. And as long as you've got contacts with with your supply chain, it's a different way of selling out there, but it's a huge market, and they're interested. And they play completely different stuff. I'd actually say that the designers who have influenced me the most are the designers that I sit down and play with in the Game Artisans. There's a game here and a game there that I'd say, oh, that was nifty, and oh, that's neat. The people who actually influence me are the people that I'm actually speaking to and designing with and prototyping with. The things that influence me is everybody else's philosophy on game design and how it seems that we've kind of converged on this idea of fun-focused game design, stripping things down to their bare essentials, attempting to find the core mechanic and building out from there. Whenever we're talking online, I remember early on the Game Artisans kind of attempted to codify a lot of ideas about what our kind of style of game design would be. We wanted to, instead of saying this is Ameritrash and this is Eurotrash, or Euro style gaming, we wanted to have a Canadian blend of the two worlds. So something that was thematic and yet highly mechanically integrated. And so a lot of our early discussions talked about theme mechanic integration and being able to have those two things working in concert. But it's also people like Oren and his extremely fun themes and excellent integration of theme and mechanic that him to me is kind of something to aspire to. He's done really amazing things. I remember years and years ago playing one of his card games, the Mask of the Red Death, that I just don't even think has made it past that small circle of people who are playing it with him. But the funny thing about Oren is that when he has a game that just has this universal appeal, he seems not to be interested in it because it's not what he wants to build. He wants to build something that's cool for him. And that too is kind of a neat characteristic of Oren's design. He can build these games that just have universal appeal, but they don't interest him because he wants to build something cool. For me, it's tough because it's two different things. I have a captive group of playtesters in my house, and they're 10 and 8 years old. But I also have only 2 real playtesters because I move around every couple years. And it's very, very difficult to stay connected with a group of playtesters that I can get really good advice from and really good quality information from. So that's part of the fact that I have to design for my children rather than anything else, because that's the audience, that's the whole demographic. That's the hard bit. What I really, really like is, and what I like to think is my approach, is I attempt to look at an experience and see if I can use a mechanic to put that experience in the head of the person playing. As a game designer, you don't particularly have a canvas except for the mind of your players. And everybody is a different type of canvas. They all take different colors very well. You have to make an experience that satisfies them. And in the case of a board game, you're going to have perhaps 5 players, 4 of whom have lost, and you have to make that loss satisfying for them as well. That's a very, very difficult thing to do. I think that actually Jung said that game design is one of the hardest things you can possibly do. You have to get into the head of your players by writing some rules on a piece of paper and giving them probably the most boring material on earth, which is cardboard, to play with and create a completely new experience that they haven't necessarily gotten from any other game. And the market is currently full of all sorts of interesting games. So I want to look at the experience. So for example, in one prototype that I'm developing, and I've been developing for about 8 years probably, it's a game called Thunder Chief. And I wanted to see if I could replicate the kind of tense, stressful experience of being, on one hand, an ECM operator on a Thunder Chief in the Vietnam War in 1965, not 66, not 64, only 1965. In the Vietnam War in 1965, when basically ground, like the surface-to-air missiles that the Viet Cong were using, were more or less on par with the skill of the Thunder Chief aircraft that were moving in to try to destroy them. So there's no real combat there except for the individual firing of missiles kind of at the end of the engagement. The entire game is a game of cat and mouse between 2 electronic warfare officers who are kind of turning on, shutting off, and feinting and weaving electronically only until one gets a good bead on the other and launches a missile at them. So I thought, how can you create that tension? How can you make, for example, a missile, a SAM site that's partially hidden at the start of the game and is slowly revealed? How can you make it so that the Americans can use terrain to be able to do nape of the earth flying and disengage from the SAM's radar? All these various things, and I wanted to boil it down to the minimum necessary components. Currently, it's just a deck of cards. So designing the experience and paring away all of the non-essential elements and still retaining that central experience, I think is really, really important. We're no longer 1970s Avalon Hill. We don't attempt to put every single stat into the game. Everything is not a CRT. There has to be a playable game that creates a given experience. To me, of course, experiences in warfare are probably the most interesting, just given my background. But I want to replicate that experience or paint something in the player's mind that creates that tension of dancing with a surface-to-air missile, and that'd be my approach. I want to create that experience.